Welcome to Silicon Bytes episode 67. Before we get into this, thank you so much to everybody who has become a patron of the channel, everybody who's bought me a coffee, and especially everybody who is supporting the creation of our documentary film as well. All your donations to that are massively appreciated, and you will see the evidence of that soon as well. We'll be sharing news on that on the channel over the next couple of weeks. This episode is in two parts and it covers Mr. Carlson's trip to Moscow. Love him or loathe him, Tucker Carlson has a knack for sucking the oxygen out of the information space. He creates friction, he generates headlines, he grabs attention. Nothing is what it seems is the apparent philosophy behind his media persona. He is just asking the difficult questions that nobody else wants to ask, looking for alternative ideas and uncovering the deep state conspiracies that manipulate us and ruin our lives. The trouble is, the overall framing of his work is deeply imbued with highly partisan and propagandistic narratives. He does have a purpose, in fact, and it is itself deeply manipulative and aligned with oligarchic money interests. No wonder the Kremlin and Russian state TV love him so much. No wonder he's been called back to Moscow when they find themselves in a bit of a pickle. His persona perfectly matches the strategic purpose of networks like RT, Russia Today, whose strapline is question everything. The underlying message behind much of Russian propagandistic media is "Всё не так однозначно," or "it's really not so simple." Stoke division, yes. Divide and conquer, of course. But fundamentally, Russian propaganda is about denying your agency, preventing you from uniting, collaborating, and organizing to resist the forceful expansion of its influence and interests. It does this by eroding trust, sowing division and enmity, and fostering the nihilistic idea of informational ambiguity. There is no truth or morality, it implies. It's all relative. My opinion is just as valid as your facts. It's complicated. Politics makes no difference at all and never can do. Politics, in fact, is not real. There are two sides to every story, always, and both are lies in their own way. These are some of the general thrusts of Russian propagandistic method, but lies can be equated with truth. The aggressor with the victim. It is extremely cynical in its methodology. It's corrosive, but it's also effective. Think doublespeak from Orwell's 1984. Black is white, up is down, and Russia always lies. This stuff shouldn't work, but it does. And increasingly, this approach has power in the era of weaponized social media algorithms, fragmented media, weak institutions, disenchantment with party politics, and the decline of class identities. It's the outer clothing of a regime that does not pursue ideology or morality of any kind, but a pure projection of power and material demands. But because those material demands are in the service of a small parasitic elite with an extraction mentality, the result is always going to be negative. They are not grasping for power as an extension of their country's or their people's interests, but they are doing it simply for their own material benefit. Mr. Carlson Comes to Moscow is the antithesis of the warm-hearted film of 1939, where an innocent and noble character and outsider tackles the cynicism of the Washington establishment. In this instance, we have an arch-propagandist, an insider and beneficiary of the system, who is posing as a revolutionary, building an audience based on the pretense that he wants to tear down that system. Mr. Carlson is returning to Moscow to generate more media fodder to fuel the grievance-based politics that have worked so successfully for him, and of course, which work very well domestically for Vladimir Putin as well. And clearly, he's on a mission. returning to the source of lies, conspiracies, and weaponized information to serve the masters of manipulation in the Kremlin. After his lengthy interview with Vladimir Putin, which perhaps did not have the impact that either of them had intended, Tucker Carlson returns to Moscow to interview Foreign Minister Lavrov, a man for whom lying is as natural as breathing and excreting. And informational excrement is likely what we'll be treated to in this interview. There is a breakdown of that interview, a full breakdown in the second episode of this two-part Bites, but we will take some quotes from that interview in a minute and we will analyze them in the light of 1984. We came back to Moscow yesterday to interview the Foreign Minister of Russia, Sergei Lavrov, the longest-serving foreign minister in the world, Carlson said. Carlson, who, as we know, is a conservative American pundit and former Fox News anchor, said in a video posted on X late Tuesday, Carlson justified the visit, saying he spoke to Lavrov to shed light on the Russian perspective on the ongoing war with Ukraine. Even that language is, of course, indirect, almost making the war sound accidental. No, this is Putin's invasion of Ukraine, a sovereign state, which was largely enabled by a broad mass of Russia's population. Many millions of them benefit financially from the continuation of that war. Now, before we dive into the detail, Carlson has offered to interview Zelensky in Kiev. The Free Speech Libertarian Brigade will say, well, this is laudable, and it gives Carlson some credibility. The same, of course, is being said of Lex Friedman, who has similarly made an offer to interview both sides, Putin and Zelensky. The trouble is, presenting this as a both sides problem risks equating the aggressor with the victim. It risks eroding the moral clarity of the situation and elevating lies and opinions on the same level as facts and values. Sure, you could interview Hitler in 1944 and hear why he thinks the Jews represent such a problem to Aryan values. The dictator may even believe some or all of the stuff that he spouts, but that does not make it right or moral or valid. Well, now translate this to Putin. What do you think the perspective of a KGB-trained sociopathic dictator might be, who orders the citizens of a neighboring country to be slaughtered, tortured, and kidnapped? Someone shown to be an habitual and pathological liar who has his opponents murdered on a regular basis. Then you interview his victim and it elevates their narratives to the same level. You may not mean to do that, but that is what happens in reality. By suggesting a both sides approach, you are equating the victim and the aggressor, the democratically elected leader with the tyrant. It's not appropriate. And it's disingenuous to say that this is any kind of journalism. Tucker Carlson is playing a disingenuous game within the information ecology, the mechanics of which he can hardly be unaware of. Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova said the interview was extensive and had lasted more than 1.5 hours. As we'll analyse in a minute, it covered topics such as Russia's difficult relations with the US, the impact of all this on world geopolitics, the possibilities of the future state of affairs and relations between them. All these were raised, as well, of course, as the topic of Ukraine. Lavrov is an effective liar. He is articulate and infinitely cynical. This was not the car crash interview of sycophancy, delusions and tedium comparable to that between Carlson and Putin, which happened recently. In the promotional video posted Tuesday, Carlson blasted Biden's handling of Russia's war, claiming it has driven the US ever closer to a nuclear conflict with Russia. This is a clear repetition of a key Kremlin talking point, and in fact, it suggests why this trip happened at all and why it happened now. Moscow's nuclear bluffs are not working. The West has heard these arguments too many times and seen that Putin's red lines are mostly illusory. The Oreshnik missile was a dud. It did not have the coercive, terroristic impact, I think, that Putin expected that it would. We are, unbeknownst to most Americans, in a hot war with Russia, Carlson proclaimed without citing evidence. He criticized Biden over the recent decision to allow Ukraine to use American-made longer-range weapons to strike Russian territory. This put the US closer to nuclear war than at any time in history, he suggested, again, without providing any distinct proof for that. Lavrov's narrative was a little more nuanced and interesting, though. It reveals where the Kremlin's strategic focus may be moving. Europeans, they shouldn't suffer for America's fight, but focus on their own security and prosperity, he said. No doubt that means dropping sanctions. We must assume also that means rebuilding a cynical, transactional relationship with the emerging strength of a revanchist Russian empire. At least that is the implication of his words and tone. It's similar to the triumphalist tone seen in recent weeks by Vladimir Putin at a speech he gave at Valdai. Lavrov is clearly trying to exploit and amplify transatlantic friction, which is suggested by what Europe's relationship with Trump may turn out to be over the coming months and years. It implies Europe has been acting as a surrogate for US policy in Ukraine, a puppet without agency, and not following Europe's own natural and sovereign interests. This, of course, is a crucial time, and Lavrov is trying to play up the so-called isolationist trends of the US under Trump. He also presents Russia as a rational actor, a partner willing to engage in dialogue, but being prevented from doing so directly with Europeans because of US meddling, US imperial arrogance. Lavrov appeals to the pride of Europeans, imploring them to distance themselves from American leadership, again with the implication that their future lies in a cooperative relationship with Russia and stability in energy supplies, i.e. getting their energy again from Russia. Clearly, the strategic intention behind this is the destabilization of the EU and NATO, if not the fragmentation and even destruction of those institutions. You don't even have to read this into the words. You don't have to presume this, because many of the propagandists make it quite clear that this is the ultimate ambition. George Orwell would have appreciated the irony of many of Lavrov's statements. Timofey Milofanov, president of the Kiev School of Economics, has helpfully broken down the parallels between the logic of Lavrov and its translation into the world of 1984. Lavrov said, "We started the operation to end the war which the Kiev regime was conducting against its own people in Donbass." This clearly is not true. There's no factual basis for that. Its parallel in 1984 is the phrase "war is peace, hate is love," that kind of stuff. Lavrov said territorial integrity must be respected only if the governments respect the rights of their own people. The analogy in 1984, freedom is slavery. These are just a few short words, but they represent a fundamental rewriting of the post-World War II international order. The idea essentially negates the concepts of sovereignty and self-determination, suggesting instead that the violation of a nation's borders is acceptable if the aggressor deems that the government of its adversary is illegitimate. This may be couched in all sorts of justifications and puffed up language, but it is basically an excuse to justify territorial expansion, imperialism. Lavrov said, "What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Sanctions are making us stronger." The parallel with 1984, ignorance is strength. This Potemkin facade of an argument asserts that sanctions are a beneficial challenge to Russia that ultimately will make it more competitive and stronger. As you'll know from many of the videos on this channel, the reality is very different, and they create hardship and adversity for many within Russia's population, and they reduce the economic opportunities for many others. Lavrov said the UN Charter is not a menu. You have to respect it in its entirety. This is perhaps closest we come to the Ministry of Truth, who controls the past, controls the future, who controls the present, controls the past. This is said in the world of 1984, but also this bit has a strong heritage in Russian/Soviet history and is a direct echo of Stalin's times. We fight for the people who have been living on these lands. We care about people, not about natural resources. In 1984, the party seeks power entirely for its own sake, claiming a humanitarian motive, as Lavrov does, while razing cities to the ground and committing ethnic cleansing and genocide against their populations, is about as cynical as it's possible to get. Lavrov says Ukrainian laws have systematically exterminated Russian language, culture, and religion. Or the equivalent here is the 2 minutes of hate, which is a key feature of the world of 1984. Since 2014, Russian media and cultural output, as well as increasingly genocidal propaganda, has sought to demonize and dehumanize Ukrainians. Lavrov's rhetoric is a familiar narrative of oppression and othering, fostering resentment, tapping into the politics of grievance and humiliation. Since 2012, Putin has relied more and more on the creation of external enemies to unify or simply coerce his population. Parallels with 1984's use of propaganda to create perpetual hostility has been apparent to many of the more astute observers of Russian politics, especially since the invasion of Crimea and Donbass in 2014. Well, tomorrow we will put out part 2 of this, including a detailed breakdown of Lavrov's statements from the interview. Over the course of 90 minutes, Carlson asked 35 questions, including follow-ups and clarifications. The answers given boil down to 3 basic conclusions. 1. We should fear Russia and not be so dismissive of its lame nuclear threats. Number 2, how Russia is an internal victim of a treacherous and hypocritical West, especially the US. Part 3, we hold the US in utter contempt. We hold them responsible for everything that goes wrong in the world, every ill, every terrorist act. The US is enemy number 1. And in fact, they pull the strings of everything that's going on. Israel, the Europeans, Britain, etc. Lavrov does not see any of these places as having real agency, just fulfilling the whims and desires of US foreign policy. This, of course, is absurd. All 3 of these points are absurd. There was no new information and no surprises in Lavrov's answers. Was this genuine journalism? Did it add value to our understanding of Russia's motives in the war, or indeed its next actions in that conflict? Well, absolutely not. We learned nothing at all. The interview contained no solutions for the war and no concessions that could lead us to believe in an imminent negotiation process or any willingness on the part of Russia to even negotiate in good faith. It was more whining, more accusations, and more ultimatums, the geopolitical equivalent of a toddler tantrum. Tucker treated us to a feast of Kremlin talking points with no serious challenges put up to Russia's position or the reasoning behind Lavrov's statements. No real context was provided, no history, no truth, no value, in fact. Tucker is truly a useful idiot abroad, shilling for the Kremlin's Ministry of Truth.